Sailors of Reddit, what's the weirdest / creepiest thing you've seen at sea? During WW2 my dad, a wireless operator on a minesweeper, passed by a German pilot, waving frantically from his still floating aircraft in the North Atlantic. They were under strict orders not to stop, because of the danger of subs. So they left the poor guy to certain death. My dad died a couple of years ago, but this incident haunted him throughout his life. He wept about it even in his last few hours. Edited for my stupid grandma. I came across a man hung himself on his boat 5 or 6 miles offshore about 4 or 5 years ago. The eerie and truly creepy part was realizing what it was. We just saw a boat out in the middle of oceans nowhere without anything other than blue horizon in sight at the break of dawn, and there was fairly thick fog, as it had rained the night before. Realizing that the figure hanging from the boom was a man was one of the most haunting things I'll ever see. I have family who sailed around the world. One day in the North Atlantic, their sailboat was going over some gigantic swells. They didn't have brakes at the top, so it was safe, but the boat was rising and falling way beyond the neutral. At the bottom of a trough my uncle looked up to see the sun behind a wave and the silhouette of a whale inside, above him. We were once ported out of Bahrain, and we woke up to this god-awful smell. We tossed on our coveralls and headed for the weather deck to find the cargo ship on the next dock, stacked 5 stories high with cages of live lambs. Losing your ship's service generator in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, late at night. Most of the electrical service to the ship is lost until the emergency diesel generator hopefully starts up. When you're used to all the vibrations and sounds in your living spaces, silence is deafening. It was a foggy night off the shore of Long Island, and I was on a 75-foot schooner. The fog was so thick that you couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of you. The captain tells me there is no point to continue my watch at the bow of the ship and I start talking at the stern. About that time there is thunk on the side of the ship. We both turn to see a figure dressed in black flowing robes walking towards us on the outside of the ship. The robes were scratching down the outside of the ship. It keeps coming closer and is high enough in the air that the top was about even with our heads. It turns out that it was just a black flag to mark a lobster pot, but for those first few seconds it was terrifying. Lol. Once thought I saw a small landmass on the horizon. Upon closer inspection it turned out to be a dead whale, belly up with seagulls standing on it pecking away at its flesh. Not me, but my father back in his commercial fishing days noticed that there was a t-shirt in the middle of his net after one tow. After a little investigation he found that it was not a shirt, but a human torso wearing a shirt. He said he was terrified that he would open the net and a head would roll out onto his feet, but it didn't happen. His captain radioed ahead, and they brought the torso back to the docks, where they were met by the police and a coroner. They were eventually able to identify the body based on the clothing as a victim of a plane crash that had occurred fairly recently. My dad said he offered a free lobster to the coroner, who graciously accepted it until he found out that it had been found in the net with the body. After that he got angry and told him to throw it back. Fishing out near the Great Barrier Reef and my brother who gets seasick decides to go for a swim to settle his stomach, and less than a minute after getting back into the boat a 17-foot great white went under the boat. Not a sailor, but I was on a fishing charter boat on Lake Erie. It was around 5 AM in the morning, and the water was scary calm and glass-like, and it was so foggy you could not see more than 30 feet of that. We all started hearing this plopping sound, like somebody was slapping the water with open hands. It kept getting louder and closer. At this point we had all slowly moved to the other side of the boat, not knowing WTF it was. Even the boat captain was standing there in total silence as we all just stood there and listened to this plopping sound getting closer and closer, and to the shock of us all, a deer swam by the boat. Yes, a deer. It looked to be a very large buck with at least 10 points on his rack. We were more than 10 miles offshore, so it made no sense at all. Can you say freaky? The sea is a vast and seemingly empty place. Many fail to grasp this when asking questions like, how can you just lose an airplane in the ocean? I found myself on my ship somewhere in the vast expanses of the South Pacific Ocean. We had been cautiously avoiding big storms which I knew to be all around us out further than the eye can see. Although our local ocean area was calm and peaceful, I was on watch when I noticed something out there in the distance, bobbing along, that I had never seen before, especially this far from land. As I got closer, I identified what was clearly a makeshift raft made from lashed together bamboo with a snapped mast and an empty cooler moored to the deck. Upon this raft was not a soul. The chances of coming across a raft to begin with are small enough in that part of the ocean. Thinking about the persons who once sailed that raft, why they sailed, and how they met their fate, that was what creeped me out. The stars. When you're 3 days from the nearest land, and it's a clear night. More stars than you could ever imagined, and enough shooting stars to make you run out of wishes. It was also pretty cool being stuck in the Panama Canal with a Los Angeles class submarine when they had to shut down the locks. Before we knew what was going on, there were helicopters everywhere dropping off Marines to set up around the lock. California to Los Angeles. Toilets on boats are usually plumbed with seawater because it makes no sense to sheet in your limited drinking water. One night I was taking the watch on a long haul sail up the US East Coast. We were rounding the FL Keys about to point towards Maine. I had to use the head, so I went below and pumped some water into the bowl. It was glowing in the dark. Freaked me out so much. Turns out there is photoluminescent phytoplankton in the water, which will glow if pumped into a dark toilet bowl. No longer scary, actually pretty neat. Well, I'm no sailor, but I'm in the military. On 9/11/2013 I was on a ship in the Red Sea. We were having a ceremony in remembrance of 9/11, when up floats a dead body right next to the ship. We were all locked down pretty quickly so that they could send out a couple small boats to retrieve it. Never did hear anything more about it. Pretty damn weird, if you ask me though. Heard this from a mate. Australian naval supply ship in the Great Southern Ocean, next to another naval ship. Swell was so great, the top of one ship's mast was deck level to the supply ship. Another, told by a different mate, they were fishing off the shelf off NSW, boat big enough to hold 6 blokes. A shark longer than their boat swam past. They packed up and went home. Some things are too big and have too many teeth to fish near. Not the sea, but on Lake Michigan we saw a huge float of blow-up dolls all tied together just floating. There was probably about 15 of them just tied together floating there. Was ducking strange to say the least. Probably late to this, but whatever. I was working on a car carrier 4 years ago in the Middle East. Our typical route went through pirate waters at times, and so we always picked up 4 ex-Marines as security in Aqaba, Jordan before we went. One night while we were going through pirate waters off of Yemen we started to have problems with the main engine. So we stopped and had to drift for a bit to figure out what the problem was. During this time I was working on the stern back end of the vessel. I couldn't really see anything out in the ocean. Everything was dimly lit on the ship. I don't know why, but I got bored and turned on the spotlight and there he was, this guy with a gun in a rusted little boat staring at me about 15 feet from the ship. I just stared back at him, kind of stunned. I was afraid if I reached for the radio to call one of the Marines head shoot meth Marines had weapons. So he looked at me and I looked at him and he sort of gave me a nod as if he was telling me well played and I gave him one back. Then he slowly rowed his boat back off into the deep pitch black night. I didn't know how many others there were, but I did call it in on the radio as soon as I lost sight of him. I still remember his face today, that deep stern concentrated look. Hurricane Katrina. We followed it down to provide aid for what everyone knew was going to be a disaster. It was as if the world had split in two. Above us was this beautiful sky with a few clouds strewn about, and then, not far ahead, was this ghastly monster that engulfed up the rest of the sky. It was green and purple and black. The clouds twisted in a way I've never seen before, and the seas were very deceptive. If you looked at the water you were sailing on, the swells didn't look that intense. But I saw frigates and destroyers swallowed bow first and shot through the other side. I was lucky, my ship was quite large. Even we were getting pelted on the 05 level of a supply ship TAOE, and there were forget ever walking in a straight line. Most of the time you'd be walking on the deck one moment, and then the bulkhead wall the next. I've been in rough seas before on both smaller and larger platforms, but Hurricane Katrina took the cake. It was just an event. One that I'm glad I was following and not intercepting. Hurricane Katrina. My ship had just passed Cook's Passage when the wind and swell drastically increased. From the bridge wings you could touch the top of the swell and the deck was flooded constantly. The scariest part was when we found our holds were taking in water. Finally somewhere I can tell this story, quite possibly the strangest thing I have ever seen in my life. It was about 2 AM in the middle of the Atlantic and very dark with no moon. As I was walking up to the bow of our sailboat to inspect the sails, I saw a faint glow in the water a long way off. I stared at the glow a long time before I realized there were actually two glowing objects moving quickly underwater on a collision course with our boat. Immediately I thought it was some submarine or torpedo about to ram our boat. But then the glowing shapes came right alongside the boat, perhaps a foot underwater. They were two ghostly blue dolphins, glowing brightly and so vivid and close in the clear water. I immediately realized the dolphins were being illuminated by bioluminescent plankton, but the sight was surreal. I watched them play in our bow wave for a while, imagining sailors of the past witnessing these eerie dolphin spirits, and how mind-blowing that must have been. When I was 19, I had just gone to sea for the first time with the US Navy. A few days after heading to the Gulf of Mexico for a few weeks of drug ops, we were dispatched to the Straits of Florida because Fidel Castro had opened the doors and people were fleeing Cuba in droves. It was called Operation Able Vigil. One night after standing watch all day over dozens of people had been pulled out of the water, I was standing on the 03 level of the ship with a chief, smoking a cigarette. It was the only exterior surface of the ship not coverage with refugees. It was a full bright moon that you could see reflecting on the ocean's surface, and we were talking about how crazy this all was, and looking at all of the other Navy and Coast Guard ships on the horizon doing slow circles looking for people like we were. Suddenly in the reflection of the moon, we both saw something pass through the reflection. He looked at me, and I nodded that yes, I too had seen something. He took off like a shot to the bridge, and ship started to circle back towards the thing where they see it was a person in a life preserver just floating in the middle of the Straits of Florida, hoping someone would see him. There we were on this $2 billion missile-loaded warship doing slow circles, looking for people in the water. All told my ship saved and or transported 1,800 people back to Gitmo for processing. Keeping in mind, ship's crew was only about 400 people. It left a big impression on 19-year-old me.